Hi, everyone. Thanks for spending your afternoon for the next hour or so here. And it's really exciting to be back at MIT. I think it's only the second time I've been back since I finished almost 10 years ago, so it's always fun to be back. And it's particularly fun to be back talking about this project, which, as I'll explain in a second, is very much a product of this institution. So let me first acknowledge that this is basically a book project. It's co-authored with Steve Van Solbeheer. The book was published last year, and it's really fun to keep on talking about it. It reflects about 10 years worth of effort on our part. So just in case I don't get to the end, I want to at least summarize the main findings and the key takeaways that comes out of this project. And so essentially what we're doing here is analyzing how the American public thinks about energy and their energy choices. And when we first started this project in the early 2000s, there was very little research to actually analyze, in a comparative sense, how people thought about different ways of generating electricity in particular. And that's what we set out to do with this project. So here are the key sort of takeaways from this project. First, pretty resoundingly, Americans want to express a preference for reducing the use of fossil fuels, particularly oil and coal. And as well, they also really want to increase the use of solar, wind power, and other renewables. And what's particularly interesting about this is that these attitudes are pretty stable over time, right? So we're doing, over a decade worth of public opinion work, and we don't see much differences in these attitudes over that period of time. So these are really stable findings. A second thing that comes out of this is that when it comes to what actually explains these attitudes, what matters the most are how people perceive the environmental harms associated with different energy sources. And this is a much stronger factor than their perceptions of the economic costs. In particular, as I'll emphasize as we go forward, what they have in mind are local environmental impacts, right? Not so much global warming. And this relationship between, or this difference between perceptions of harms and costs as a determinant of attitudes is the same across all fuel types. So whether we're talking about renewables or nuclear power or coal or oil or some other fossil fuel. A third point to note is that Americans' attitudes about energy are not driven by their concerns about climate change. And in fact, in many respects, they're completely uncorrelated. Which is to say that what's driving people to want more renewables or to express a preference for reducing coal is not because they're worried about climate change. And I'll explain what we mean by that more as we go forward. And then finally, there are some really important, we think, policy implications of all this. And it turns out that our sort of thinking, our understanding of people's energy attitudes, in particular the role of local environmental impacts and economic costs, is a pretty good explanation for why the public prefers EPA regulation of greenhouse gases as opposed to other policy approaches to dealing with climate change, such as a cap and trade system or carbon tax or something like that. So those, if I don't get to the end, I want to at least sort of walk away with some of the big takeaways from this project. Okay, so I mentioned that this project started at MIT. So it actually started as part of the MIT Energy Initiative. As you probably all are fairly familiar with, there have been a series of future of studies coming out of MIT. And beginning with the very first one, the future of nuclear power, at least the first edition of that report, there has been a public opinion survey done as part of the analysis. For those of you less familiar with this initial future of nuclear power study, in essence, what was done was a thought experiment. What happens if we were to essentially construct, a few hundred more nuclear power plants, both in the United States and across the world? The motivation being that climate change is a real issue. Let's think about one, non-CO2 emitting alternative for doing this. And much of the report focused on the technical aspects of this, the economic aspects, as well as a little bit the political dynamics. And as I said, there was a public opinion side to this, which is very important because one of the impediments to the development of nuclear power in the United States over the last few decades has been public opposition. We really have not constructed new power plants in this country in large part because people don't want to live anywhere near a nuclear power plant. So one of the findings that came out of this study, which was quite puzzling to us, and that was that concern about global warming essentially was unrelated with support for nuclear power. Which is to say that people who are really concerned about climate change did not express a preference for more nuclear power. They did not see those things, that as a solution to this problem. Which sort of got us thinking about whether or not the role of global warming concern in explaining preferences for other energy sources. And then thinking about how actually people think across energy sources. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, at this stage, the early 2000s, there essentially had been no work looking very closely at energy preferences beyond nuclear power and beyond oil for various historical reasons. So what this project began to do was to systematically analyze how people think about energy across these different sources. So we did essentially 10 years of public opinion projects, individual surveys, done not quite annually, but almost annually, many of them associated with the MIT Future of Energy projects. And the key question for us was the following, is what future do consumers and voters want? So what do American citizens actually want when it comes to energy? What kind of portfolio do they prefer? That's the fundamental motivating question. So what we try to do in the project is essentially, there's sort of three principal objectives. The first is to measure attitudes. Second, to compare these attitudes across energy types, energy sources. Again, focusing primarily on those sources that are used to generate electricity. And then third, to explain these attitudes, right? To explain why it is that people prefer some sources over others. And then what this might mean for energy policy generally. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about the surveys themselves, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have them about how they were conducted and things. Okay. So the first question is, what do people want, right? So this is the measurement question. To give a little context, we need to sort of go back in time a little bit to what the energy portfolio looked like in 2002, because in some ways it differs from how it looks today. So what you're looking at is a graph essentially of the portfolio of electricity generation from different sources in 2002, and then 2014. This is from data from the Energy Information Administration. And what's most noteworthy here is that in 2002, about half electricity came from burning coal. Okay, and as many of you probably know, we are relying still a lot on coal, but comparatively less than we were, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And what has replaced it is essentially natural gas, right? For reasons because we've had the shale gas revolution, we have a decline, more supply, decline in prices for natural gas. But there's also a whole suite of regulatory regulations that have come out of the federal government over the last half dozen years, in particular, which have made coal less cost competitive. The other big changes, which are a little bit harder to see, is that we've had a pretty marked increase in the use of renewables, particularly wind, and more recently solar, although solar still makes up a really small part of the overall portfolio. It's just that its growth rate has been quite extraordinary over the last 5-6 years. But this was the picture of the world we were looking at in 2002, right? Whereas primarily looking at fossil fuels and particularly coal and natural gas. And at the time, there essentially had been very little work studying how people thought about these energy sources. Okay, so we begin to survey the public. And the core question included in the surveys was the following. In essence, what we're asking people to imagine is, we put them into the situation of, we need more electricity in this country to meet demand. We need to build more power plants. We're starting to plan for this. And the question is, how should we meet this increased demand? For each power source, indicate whether you feel the U.S. should increase or reduce its use or not use it at all. And then we asked this question about 7 different energy sources: coal, natural gas, nuclear power, wind, solar, hydro, and oil. Even though we don't use oil a lot for electricity, just about 1%, we included it in our surveys. So this becomes sort of the core question in these repeated cross-sections that we do of the American public. Okay, so how does the public respond to this question? So let me first show you some the results for sort of traditional fuels, for fossil fuels. Hopefully you can see this. I tried to pick bright colors. And so essentially what we're looking at is the distribution of responses for 5 different surveys that were done over the course from 2002 to 2013. So the first thing to note about these is when it comes to coal, there's a pretty strong majority of the public that has, throughout this period of time, expressed a preference for reducing our use of coal or not using it at all. This is a consistent finding throughout all these 5 surveys. And there's only about, at most 25% of saying they'd like to see coal increased as part of the U.S. electricity portfolio. I'll skip over to oil for a second. Oil is the least popular, perhaps, of all the things we've asked about. Again, we don't use a lot of oil for generating electricity, and people like it that way. They like to see it's even reduced further or not used at all. Natural gas is sort of in between, right? So the public is generally more supportive of natural gas and certainly most supportive of all the fossil fuels. and there's actually a slight increase in time in terms of those wanting to see us increase the use of natural gas. And I think also importantly, there's comparatively fewer people that want to see us reducing the use of natural gas or not using it at all. Okay, so let's then turn to the alternatives. And yeah, you have a question?
Can you ask questions now? Or?
Sure, fire away.
So for the sampling, how informed are the board of these advantages and of the advantages and disadvantages of these different sources?
Right, so each survey is a nationally representative sample of the American public, right? So it's a representative in that sense. What I'll show you next is how people's perceptions of the attributes of these energy sources differ quite a bit. So how much harm they associate with one source, or how much I think it costs, does vary. And that ends up being a pretty important set of determinants for why they believe in these, they express these preferences, right? We don't measure directly their knowledge level, if that's what you're asking, about energy. But in the modeling we do, we control for things like education level and income and things like that as a determinant.
How do people's preference affect policy? How does...
Yeah, well, I think I'm gonna, let me come to that. Yeah, I'm gonna try to connect this to policy as we go. So the first thing you'll note with these renewables is the huge public support, right? So you ask people are basically expressing 70, 80% saying, let's expand the use of renewables. Hydro looks pretty similar, actually, not quite as strong, but there is very strong support for renewables. As I'll talk about, there's also some misperception about renewables, particularly related to cost. Nuclear power, of all the things we asked about, engenders sort of the most sort of mixed response among the public. There's a set of the public that is strongly opposed to using nuclear power. There's an equally sized segment of the public that wants to expand it quite a bit. So it is more divisive, if you will, than many other issues. And that's reflected a little bit in these data. So this sort of gives you a sense of what people actually are expressing a preference for in terms of the energy portfolio.
I've never seen a public poll reported in newspapers that showed us less than 70% support of renewables efficiency over oil, coal, gas, and nuclear. So if you go back and look at the history, I think that you will definitely see very similar attitudes going back into the 90s.
Yeah, so we don't actually have great polling going back, but when we were asking about energy a lot during the oil crises, you saw very high support for solar in particular and energy efficiency. We didn't have the same kind of questions about wind. So it's hard to say, for sure, because we don't have sort of that nice longitudinal data, but I think your suspicion is correct, that there's generally been support for alternatives widely defined for many, many decades, which I think speaks to the stability of attitudes quite a bit. Okay, so some broad takeaways from this. So people want more wind and solar, less coal, oil, and nuclear power. Natural gas is somewhere in the middle. We think these preferences are pretty stable over time. And one thing which was a little bit, which you could not take away directly from those previous graphs, but I wanted to just highlight real quick, is that there are very few people in the sample who are what we call sort of pure conservationists, who want to see us reducing the use of all energy. You don't see that kind of a pattern in the data. But there are also very few people who want to use all of the above, right, which has been the tagline of President Obama for at least the last 5 years or so. People don't want to see all of the above. There are very few people in our sample who actually express that kind of a preference. So people do make distinctions between these energy sources. Okay, so that gives you sort of a broad picture. So then the question becomes, why do they want what they want, right? And the core idea we develop in the book is that we think Americans think about energy the way they think about many other products, in particular consumer products. We call this the consumer model of preferences. And that is to say that people don't inherently dislike coal or inherently like solar power. What they do when they're thinking about energy is there are attributes about these energy sources that they have preferences about. attributes such as their perception of how much harm comes from burning that, right? So when they're thinking about coal and they're thinking about the harm, they're thinking about the adverse health impacts that comes from, a coal-fired power plant, the local pollution, which can cause, respiratory ailments, asthma, bronchitis, things of that nature. So there are these attributes that matter the most, and the two that we think matter in particular the most are the perceptions of costs and the perceptions of harm. Okay, perceptions of cost and perceptions of harm. And the thing to note is that with all of our energy sources, we don't actually have ones available to us currently with given technology that are both what we call sort of cheap and clean, right? We have sources that are cheap. They tend to be dirty. We have sources which are clean. They tend to be comparatively more expensive, right? So this creates a trade-off. And people are thinking through these different dimensions when they're expressing preferences. So this graph, which I think is helpful to illustrate this, is basically trying to measure these two different dimensions. So on the y-axis is something called levelized costs, which you can sort of think about as the price or the cost of bringing a new power source online if we were to start constructing it today. So it incorporates everything from the cost of the energy itself to the labor to the construction materials, et cetera, that you need to bring a source online. And these are all sort of utility scale facilities. And then social cost is sort of the monetized value of the particularly the adverse public health impacts from using an energy source. You can also think about environmental impacts. So we took these estimates from Michael Greenstone, who's actually a former MIT economist, still an economist, just went to Chicago. And everything is pegged to existing coal, right? So everything here is relative to existing coal. So the thing to take away is that relative to existing coal, most things have lower social costs, right? Which is to say there are fewer environmental harms, relatively speaking, than coal. Nuclear power is a little bit hard in these kind of equations, so I'm gonna punt for a moment on nuclear power because there are different dimensions related to that energy source, but I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like. But then in terms of the actual cost of bringing these sources online, everything is more expensive, right? So this is just to sort of highlight the fact that if these two attributes matter, people are essentially trying to figure out where their energy sources sort of fit in this kind of a space. And the argument here is that these two attributes in particular are the strongest drivers of people's energy preferences. Okay, so then we measure this, right? So in the surveys, we ask people their perceptions about harms and their perceptions about cost. So the first graph I'll show is perceptions of cost. We, in essence, ask people to tell us what they think about the cost of generating electricity from these different sources. These are a bit noisy, but each of these bars reflects a different survey that was done, again, for the 7 different energy sources that we asked about. The way this is aligned, the higher bars signify a perception or belief that these are less expensive sources of energy. So a couple things to note real fast. I think one thing that really stands out is how people view renewables. There's a perception that renewables are the least expensive, right? And recall, the first survey here is done in 2002, before we sort of seen the advances in technology and the penetration of renewables. So the cost was comparatively a lot higher in objective terms than other sources. But the public tends to believe that these sources are particularly inexpensive, whereas they believe oil and nuclear power are the most expensive, and coal and natural gas are somewhere in between. You have a question? Right, so these are in this case, thanks for asking that. So to clarify, what we think this is economic costs. It's not social costs. So this is the price of generating electricity from these sources, not accounting for the social costs, right? The social cost is what we're going to call environmental harms, and that shows a slightly different pattern, right? So here, not surprisingly, people tend to believe that renewables are clean. They don't have the social costs or the local environmental impacts that fossil fuels do, right? So you actually see pretty systematic evidence that people believe that these generate no harm in terms of generating electricity. Whereas in terms of the fossil fuels, coal in particular and oil as well, people tend to correctly identify these as producing higher environmental impacts. Okay, nuclear power, again, nuclear in many ways is similar, in some ways is different, because people tend to think about different kinds of impacts with nuclear power than the other sources. They're thinking about waste, they're also thinking about accidents. But people tend to hold the perception that that it's a particularly harmful way to generate electricity. Okay, so this just sort of shows you overall patterns. So if we sort of summarize and sort of collect the results so far, this would suggest that people have the relative harms about right. Objectively speaking, that people tend to realize that fossil fuels are create more impact, renewables less. They tend to get those things right. When it comes to cost, they tend to get this right, but only for traditional fuels. When it comes to renewables, they tend to be highly optimistic and hold a belief that they are considerably inexpensive. Again, this has changed a lot over the course of the time from when we started, but certainly when we began this project, that was not the case. So people are underestimating the price of electricity, and there's an important implication that I want to sort of highlight now as a bit of foreshadowing to some analysis I'll show you a little bit later. And there's an implication of this, which is to say if we actually corrected people's misperceptions about renewables. In particular, they're already incorporating into their beliefs the idea that they are less impactful to the environment. If we corrected their misperceptions about cost, what this should do is push them to sort of reduce their support for these powers, right, for this power source, right? So if we're correct and these attributes matter, if the perceptions of the attributes are not right and we correct them, in this case, this is going to disadvantage renewables because they tend to underestimate the costs, okay? And I'll show you evidence that this is in fact the case in a few minutes. Okay, so let me then turn to sort of what we'll call valuations. And specifically what I mean by that is we want to know how these attributes, so how these perceptions of economic cost and environmental harm actually that correspond to those preferences that I showed you, right? How this translates into preferences for different energy sources. So our goal here is essentially to estimate the importance or weight of these attributes, right? So how important is these perceptions of harm or these perceptions of cost in terms of explaining how people think about solar, nuclear, natural gas, other power sources? And how do they compare to other things which probably matter too, right? Political beliefs, right? So political ideology, partisan identification, demographics, education level, income, gender, right? Other factors that may also explain people's attitudes about energy sources. And then it could be things like where you live. Region of the country may differ, right? Regions of the country use different sources of energy that might play into how they think about these issues as well. So what we try to do here is come up with an estimation of how important these attributes actually are. And we pursue two different strategies. One is a statistical strategy, so using multiple regression analysis, which I'll explain in a minute. And then we also embedded in the surveys various experiments. This is a way to manipulate information about costs and harms and the importance of global warming and see if that moves preferences in any way. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of these strategies and what they reveal. Okay, so first, we estimate a very basic regression model. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I want to at least give you a flavor for what we're doing here. So essentially what we do is we are trying to explain variation in preferences for the future use of solar power or nuclear power, right? So we're basically estimating separate regression models for each of these different power sources for each individual survey. And what we're interested in here in particular are the weight of these coefficients on environmental harm and cost, and then we'll compare them to some of the demographics as well. So what we can do here is look to see how these compare for each fuel, right? So what is the relative weight of harms and costs for solar? What's the relative weight and harms and costs for nuclear power, right? So we can pull out of this model these regression coefficients, and that gives us one measure of these weights. We can then compare these weights across fuels, right? So does harm matter in the same way, the same magnitude for nuclear power that it does for coal, that it does for solar power? So we can make a comparison in that sense, do something similar for the economic cost component. We can also look to see how much of the variation in people's energy preferences is explained by these two attributes. I'm not going to show you any of this in the interest of time, but it turns out that just knowing how people perceive the environmental harms and economic costs of an energy source explains about 90% of the variation in their attitudes, which is to say things like political preferences, education, income. Once you account for their perceptions of harms and costs don't really matter very much. And one interpretation of this is people are not really political in the sense that we usually think about them being political and explaining their public opinions about issues. That is not the case here once we account for perceptions of harms and costs. So that's sort of the basic setup of the regression, and I'll just show you one sort of graphical representation of these results. So let me take a minute to explain this to you. So in essence, what you're looking at are, again, over the course of 4 different surveys that we did. I'm sort of graphing out here the regression coefficient, or what we're calling the weight of these different attributes. So we have harms, we have costs, and something I didn't mention before, we have a measure of how concerned they are about global warming, right? So we're entering into these equations this notion, or trying to measure how concerned they are about global warming, which gives us some assurance that we're actually capturing local environmental impacts as opposed to something else. So the way these are measured, a higher value of harm here means that it's less harmful. A higher value of cost means it's less expensive. So we would expect that as something is perceived to be less expensive or less harmful, we should see a positive weight or positive coefficient, and we expect to see more support for that fuel source. Global warming, by contrast, is measured such that higher values represent more concern, so we might expect to see a negative coefficient in the case of coal and a positive in the case of renewables like solar. Okay, so lots going on here. Let me sort of try to highlight a few results. One result which is noteworthy is that in all cases, the weight of harm is most important. Right? Across all of the analysis we did, across all the surveys, in general, it's about 2 to 3 times more important than cost, right? Which is to say that the weight of harm in people's assessments of their energy preferences is the most important, is how they're thinking about local environmental impacts. Cost is also important, but in a relative sense, it's less important. The other thing to highlight is the global warming finding, right? You'll sort of see in some of these results here that in many of the surveys, the global warming weight is hovering around 0, right? Which is to say it's not an important factor in how people we're sort of separating people on sort of supporting or opposing different energy sources. And that's pretty consistent across the different energy types, although it does begin to change a little bit in the most recent surveys. You see that people who are most concerned about global warming begin to express less support for coal, and it's generally been a little bit more important in the renewable model as represented by solar here. Okay, so this gives you a sense of the importance of these different attributes in explaining people's preferences. Okay. So one question that comes out of this, we're basically showing you a statistical association, right? So is this causal, right? Can we say that how people think about these perceptions is actually what's pushing them or causing the differences in their perceptions about or their preferences for future energy use? Which sort of leads to the question, can we actually move people, right? Can we change their preferences or can we at least test that out by giving them some information about the true price of energy sources, the true environmental harms, or the true relevance of climate change. So one way to sort of test whether or not we can interpret these statistical associations as causal is to do experiments, right? So we embedded in the surveys a variety of experimental treatments to try to push at this question. And I'm just going to show you one, just give you a flavor for how these experiments worked. Most of the results are pretty consistent. So here was the basic setup. This came from the 2007 survey that we did. So there's a control group that gets no information. And in fact, all the results I showed you so far is from a control group, right? They received no information about the cost or local environmental impacts or global warming effects of using different energy sources, right? They were just asked that question I showed you at the top of the talk. And then for some segments of the survey, we introduced some information prior to them getting that question, right? The various treatments. And these are randomly assigned, so you can take advantage of the randomization to make sure that you're getting, you can estimate a nice effect. So in this particular experiment, we're varying information on costs. So we're going to provide information on costs, which I'll show you in a second. And in particular, in the survey, we are digging into the nuclear power question. So the difference between the two treatments is varying the price of nuclear power. And we can see how that makes a difference. And then this information is provided to them immediately before they're asked their preference about how they want to increase or reduce or keep the same different energy sources. So here are the experimental conditions that we included in this survey. So basically they're told that, the International Energy Agency has estimated the cost for a family of 4 of generating electricity from different power sources, and here's what it comes down to, right? Here are the actual costs from different energy sources. And this is, the way you're looking at it is how they saw it, although there was no red highlighting the nuclear. That's why I'm trying to highlight to you one of the differences, right? So they're just given this information, right? They're told essentially that fossil fuels, nuclear power, are generally less expensive, and that renewables are much more expensive. Again, I want to highlight this has changed quite a bit in recent times, but that's where we were at the moment. So what's important here is not so much as is the number absolutely correct. It's sort of getting this getting the order correct, right? Thinking about these things in relative terms. The second treatment is exactly the same, except we manipulated the price of nuclear power, right? This was a survey that was targeted in particular nuclear power. So here we made nuclear power the same cost as coal, right? The idea, so if we're right about attributes, this should increase the support for nuclear power. If we're right about the attributes, then just information in general should increase the support for fossil fuels and perhaps reduce support for renewables, right? Because we're being hit in the face with the fact that renewables are more expensive. Okay? So that's the basic setup. Here are the results. So essentially, because the two treatments were essentially the same and there's no difference between them, I just collapsed them in all cases except for nuclear power. So let me start with the top set of results. So as you see here, so here's the results for the control group, and the numbers here reflect the fact this was on a 5-point scale was the survey question, right? So a response of 4 would mean pretty high level of support for basically increasing the use of an energy source, where a 2 would be reduced. Okay, so with coal, it starts out being fairly low, reflecting the fact people generally want to reduce its use. But if you tell them or information about the cost, that's generally less expensive to produce electricity from it, it actually shifts support up by 0.44 if you take the number at its literally, right? So essentially it moves up about ½ a point on the scale, which is a pretty significant, substantively speaking, effect. Something similar for natural gas and oil, also see a positive effect. When it comes to renewable, you see the opposite, right? So by correcting what we think was a misperception that renewables are less expensive, it essentially pushes people to support them less, right? Again, this is sort of pushes on the idea that these attributes matter quite a bit, and when you provide information, it may correct some misperceptions that the public holds. On nuclear power, recall that we had 2 different treatments. They both work in the same direction, so they're both making nuclear power more popular, if you will, because again, relatively speaking, it was a less expensive of the energy choices being less expensive than those being that were presented to them, and the effects essentially are only significant statistically with the second treatment, but directionally, people are becoming more supportive of nuclear power once you provide information about its relative costs. So what this does for us, we think, is it sort of validates the idea that it's these attributes that matter, right? Because we can essentially push people by providing them with some information. Okay, so just pulling away for a second from this, what does this all mean? People tend to give more weight to harms than costs. This is true across all the fuels. And global warming concerns appear to be secondary. In fact, they're often completely uncorrelated with energy choices. Okay? So this would have been a really bad place for us to stop this project because it's kind of depressing, right? Particularly on the global climate change, given that it's such an important problem. And we started thinking about implications for policy. We didn't really want to end there because it was very unsatisfying to us. And it sort of did cause distress, depression, maybe it's too strong, but yeah.
Clarify me, what you say harm, global warming is a type of harm, right? So if you could...
That's right. So to be precise, and I can't fully go into it, but when we think when we're asking them about their perceptions of harm, we have good reason to believe that it's local environmental impacts that matters here, right? So they're not thinking about climate change when they're sort of revealing their information about harm. They're thinking about air pollution and the adverse health effects that might come with burning coal, oil, lesser degree natural gas. They're thinking about water pollution. They're thinking about toxic waste. and things of that nature. And we have experiments that pushed on those dimensions of attributes, right? So by providing more information, let's say, on the combustion of coal and the fact that it produces air pollutants that cause adverse health effects or creates toxic emissions, that actually reduces support for coal, right? So we're pretty confident that what this is tapping into are local environmental impacts. And in fact, when we experimented with them by talking about climate change, it didn't move the public in the same way. So we do think that they are making this distinction. And we have different we sort of triangulate lots of different ways to sort of give us confidence that that's what this is tapping into. Okay?
Now, for this second part of the study, how to go forward, you exposed what Americans want and kind of why they want it, but did you study what they're getting and why they're getting it in terms of the energy mix that we have currently today? Because there's a lot of research saying that really, the American people have no say in policy, only the kind of special interest groups, the control groups, the high power groups. So how is that last mile of actually policy effectiveness, factor into the study?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we didn't look at that. That wasn't a big part of the analysis, but in a couple of surveys, we did ask people about what their expectations were about whether or not the U.S. would actually adopt a portfolio consistent with what they expressed a preference for. And there was actually quite a bit of pessimism that we weren't going to actually we weren't going to change our portfolio in a way consistent with their preferences, if you will, right? That doesn't speak directly to your question, but I think it's some evidence that there's a gap between what people want and what they think they're going to get. Now, is that because of politics or something else? We can't say, right? But one could certainly speculate in that sense.
But that would be the part of the moving forward, I guess, that it's absolutely critical that people have the information that they can actually see that the political system's not working to their favor. Because I was reading, I think, Wall Street Journal last week, and it's really that there's zero almost impact of the public in policy, like zero.
Mm-hmm.
And it's striking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, go ahead.
There's a professor at Tufts who's written a book, I think, called Shadow Government, and he would be a person to ask this question too, whether he studied that in relationship to energy policy. But if we have seen public polling saying we want renewables, we want efficiency, 80, 70% since 1973, we don't see that reflected in any budget anywhere in the United States on a state, local, or federal level. Yeah,
I mean, I think, so we don't speak to that, I can't speak to that directly from this analysis, right? But there is some evidence that at a state level, for example, we do see much more variation in policy, states adopting various, policies towards renewables in particular. And there's some evidence that does reflect citizen demand. The federal level, it's harder to make that translation, but I think there is some connection, but that's sort of outside the scope of what we're doing here. Okay, yeah.
My basic question is, why don't you segment the population? I'm thinking of Yale. They have these 6 U.S. groups, from the what they call the dismissive, which are, say, coal miners in Kentucky and West Virginia, to the concerned, which are, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if you want to shift people's opinions, you shift them very differently. Right? I mean, you can argue that no amount of information is going to shift the dismissive group, but they might shift other people in the middle and so on. It looks to me like you could, with your data, because you asked for their political affiliation and other things, you could segment if you wanted to, but you choose not to segment the US population and look at the entire population. All your slides were the entire US population. Why?
Why? That's a fair question. So, and I'll answer it in a couple of ways, right? So, so what we're trying to do is get a sense of sort of the national mood, if you will, on different and people's preferences for energy, right? So we're trying to get a sense of sort of where the public is sort of writ large, if you will, right? It's possible that within our experiments that one could say, okay, maybe that effect differs. It's conditional on let's say your political affiliation, or it's conditional on other demographic characteristics, which essentially is what the Yale group does, right? They basically divide the public into these 6 Americas, looking at their demographic characteristics and their political affiliation, things like that. But my larger answer, I think one could do that. We didn't do that. That's a fair criticism. But the answer I'd like to.
It's a question.
It's a question. Why didn't we? Yeah. So here's the reason. The big takeaway from this, and I'll show you of this in a moment, and then I'm going to conclude, is that we don't think the way forward is to try to move people on climate change. Right? And the reason why is that this is a very low salient issue for most of the public. Most of the public's not willing to pay very much to address climate change, but they are willing to they are movable on energy in particular. So there are strategies to get to the same place by pushing towards cleaner energy, which gives you some of the climate benefits, but you don't have to talk about climate change directly. So that's where I was going next, to try to explain why we think that is. And if that's unsatisfactory, perhaps I'll try again. But when we sort of, what I don't have time to show you here, one thing we do in the book is we analyze people's preferences about climate change. And a couple of things are quite clear. One, despite the national public opinion polls that say 70% are concerned, 55% say it's because of natural causes. When you really look hard at people's preferences about climate change, it's a very low salient issue. It's low salience, it's a lower priority than most other environmental issues. So Gallup has been asking about climate or environmental attitudes for over 2 decades. And when they ask about what you're personally most concerned about, climate change always ranks at the bottom among other environmental issues. People are concerned about local air quality, local water quality, toxic waste. Climate change does not register in the same level of personal concern for folks. We do analysis trying to measure people's willingness to pay to address climate change. It's very low. There's not a lot of latent demand to address climate change directly. And we think what the experiments basically tell us is that if you were to educate people, it may actually be counterproductive, right? Because if you start telling people that renewables are more expensive, that's just going to push them away, because they're not inherently in love with solar, as we say, or wind. What they like about solar and wind is that it's less harmful, and they think it's less expensive, right? So if it's actually not less expensive, then education may have some diminishing returns in that sense. So this sort of left us trying to figure out how to move forward, and we spent the latter part of the book trying to do this. So I do want to leave time for discussion, so I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly. But if you think broadly about energy or climate policy options as it relates to the electricity sector, there are generally 3 things people talk about, right? There are regulatory caps, right? You can think about the EPA power plant as being a version of a regulatory cap, perhaps a little bit indirectly so. But that's essentially what it is, right? Trying to reduce the emissions from existing fossil fuel power plants. You can think of renewable portfolio standards similarly, right? Basically requiring that electricity providers provide some percentage of electricity from renewable sources. And more than 30 states now have renewable portfolio standards in place. That's one kind of instrument we could do, regulation, right? Cap and trade, right? So the 2009 Waxman-Markey bill, which got a lot of fanfare in Congress, but ultimately was not passed through both chambers, put in place a tradable allowance system modeled after the sulfur dioxide program we've had in this country since 1995 or so. Generally, this is thought to be a more efficient policy choice than a regulatory cap alone. Right? A third option might be a carbon tax, right? Another market-based mechanism that could be done sort of as a fuel tax or higher up in the production stream as a production tax. This is perceived to be more efficient than regulatory caps, and perhaps easier to implement than a cap and trade system, right? So these are sort of the menu of things that people often talk about. And what we want to show you is that we think our focus on attributes actually explains preferences across these different climate policy options, okay? So if you take a look at where the public is on these 3 policy choices, this comes from both data we did as well as other surveys out there. You sort of average together support across these different policy choices. You generally find about 3/4 of the population supportive of some sort of EPA regulation on greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's pretty high support for a policy. Comparatively speaking, for cap and trade, you find in some surveys either a slim majority or just below majority of support for cap and trade. And on carbon tax, I should say, you get much more variation. People generally don't know exactly what this means, and there's a lot of variance depending on how the question is asked, in particular, what the level of the tax is and what the revenue might be used for. Not surprisingly, if you tell people there's going to be an income tax paired with a carbon tax, people like that. They don't like it as much when you tell them the government's going to spend that money in some way, even on cleaner energy. But you see quite a bit of variation, and what I think is a little bit puzzling about this is that where the public is, they're supportive of the least efficient policy. Right? So of those policy options, regulation is basically agreed to by all to be the least efficient. And for those of you following EPA's Clean Power Plan, this is a complicated mess. It may work, but it's really complicated, and it's not the most efficient way to go about cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, why might this be? And we think the answer actually relates very much to what we have discovered about how people think about energy. So when it comes to EPA regulation, we think there is evidence to suggest that people prefer regulation because they believe it also goes after the things they value, in particular local environmental impacts. So when they think about EPA regulation, even for carbon, they believe, they actually understand and incorporate into their preferences the idea that there are co-benefits from burning less coal, right? Going along with getting fewer carbon dioxide emissions, you get less mercury, you get less soot, less sulfur dioxide, things like that. They see this as environmental policy. They do not make these same connections with comparable policies such as a carbon tax or cap and trade, which may go after carbon, objectively in the same way. They see these as climate policies, and they're less supportive of climate policies than they are of environmental policies. So just to show evidence of this, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to show one graph. But if you sort of figure out the composition of people's support for these different policy options, not surprisingly, how people's concern about global warming is important. And in fact, people who are most concerned about global warming express slightly more preference for a cap and trade system than regulation. But when you sort of figure out the relevance of other attributes, in particular the local environmental harms of both fossil fuels and renewables, as well as costs, these factors actually help explain why there's so much more support for a regulatory cap. And without getting too far in the weeds here, the important thing to note is that people are making a connection between how they view the harms and costs of energy sources with regulation, but not with these alternatives, right? And this explains the comparative relative support for EPA regulation. And not surprisingly, if you listen carefully to how President Obama, Gina McCarthy, who's the EPA administrator, talks about the Clean Power Plan, there's a lot of emphasis on local environmental benefits. They do talk a little bit about climate change, but they're talking largely about public health, because those are the things that the public values much more than how they view the benefits from a climate change standpoint. So we think there's some important lessons to be learned from that. Okay, let me just conclude with some implications here. So what we think this means is that concern about climate change is not enough. So a majority concern about the climate does not translate to a majority support for climate legislation, right? Those things are not equivalent. And often we're misled, I think, by reporting on surveys to think that, because so many people believe in climate change as a problem, that's going to translate into policy support. And I think actually citizen demand for climate policy per se is pretty soft, which is why Congress has been sort of let off the hook, if you will, on many policies. And then the final point to say, we say here, this is probably a little bit too strong, but you could think about addressing climate change without talking about climate change. I don't want to overstate that. But the point here is there are many strategies to going after carbon dioxide emissions which can be talked about in a variety of ways, right? They can be talked about in terms of these other environmental impacts. And moreover, one could politically go after other aspects of burning fossil fuels that the public is really worried about, particularly these local environmental impacts, and basically gets many of the same benefits in terms of carbon dioxide, right? So you see quite a bit of support among the public for current EPA activity on regulating mercury or particulate matter or sulfur dioxide and things like that. And the reason, again, is that people are really valuing these local environmental harms, not so much the global ones. Okay? I think I will stop there. I had an anecdote, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it at that, and then we can open up for questions and discussion. So thank you, first of all. Please.
I have a question. So you said if you gave people information right before you surveyed them, you could change their attitudes and perceptions. But did you ever follow up with them to see if that stuck, or did they just change the way they answered the survey and then eventually went back to their old thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the structure of the surveys were such they were not panel designed, so we didn't re-interview the same people, right? So it could very well be that what we're seeing is, I don't want to call it an artifact, but it's a short-term effect, right? That may not have sort of a long-term effect of changing their perceptions. Yeah, I don't really have a great answer for that question. That said, I think you could look into the data and you see, for example, with natural gas and prices, right? So we've had a pretty sustained trend of lower natural gas prices through the survey period. And the weight of that actually increased, which may reflect the fact that people are actually learning, and it may actually explain some of their increased support for natural gas, right? So that's not direct evidence, but one might look at that. Now, but oil may work in the opposite direction, right? Because now we're in this period of time where oil, after a decade of being at historical highs, is now, nearing historical lows. That may push in the opposite direction, right? But one could do a kind of analysis like that, but it's not. We didn't do that in our actual experiments. Yeah.
One conclusion you have is about the misperception of costs and misperception of harms. But I wonder if you ask people if you gave them a true sense of what the levelized and social costs were together in harms, they actually have a true sense of the harms. So did you try the interaction between costs and harms?
So we did, I'm sure we did at some point. The best example I can think of is in one of the experiments, we had a treatment condition where you got information about both costs and harms. There's also one condition where you got information about cost, local harms, and climate change. And when you put all those together, they did a little bit of canceling out of each other because things often moved in opposite directions, right? So in a statistical sense, you often found that it didn't sort of move people in a uniform way, right? But that provides some evidence that if you give them a fuller picture of the information, that it does have some influence. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that people were generally getting the perceptions of harms correct, right? So it's hard to move people on harms because they already sort of have integrated that information into their thinking, whereas cost is where people tended to be less accurate, I guess. Yes?
Can you say a little more about who was surveyed?
Sure. So these were cross-sectional, these were national representative surveys of the American public. So, Americans 18 and over. They were web-based surveys, which are now pretty common, but they were still national representative samples. Each survey was about 1,500 to 2,000 people, thereabouts.
Any breakdown of?
So, national representative would basically, yeah. So, I could pull that information up, but if the sampling was done correctly, it should reflect the public at large in terms of those things, right? So we should have the right balance between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, college-educated and not, et cetera. So we're pretty confident that the sampling is reflective of the American public.
Within the last couple of years in the climate change community, I've been hearing people talk about the importance of cities and how cities are acting where states and nations are not, and certainly the international community is not stepping up. And they're doing that because of weather emergencies and the damage they're already seeing. Right? So solar is civil defense, emergency preparedness. We know that there's going to be a weather emergency, whether it's climate change related or not. We have to prepare for it. We see what happened at Katrina, we see what happened in Sandy, so people, mayors, and other people are making that. And that's a kind of backdoor argument. Another argument that I see, and it hasn't come out explicitly generally to the public. Another argument that I see which I think I'm in a very small minority, is economic competitiveness. If you look at what's happening in the EU, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and even what's happening in China, very shortly these people, within the next couple of decades, are going to have a completely renewable electrical system, all right, by 2030 or 2050. That's what they're going for. And at that level, they're going to be able to produce goods and services without spending a dollar for fossil fuels. And that affects competitiveness and pricing around the world. And I have not seen that argument come into play anywhere yet.
Yeah, I mean, on the first or the second point, yeah, I mean, that is not part of the usual narrative around energy or climate policy, at least in the United States.
People have been talking about, oh, if we jump into this, this is a great market, energy, and renewables, we can jobs, so forth and so on. But maybe that ship has sailed for the United States.
Right. On the first point, though, I think, and this is anecdotal, but there are certainly cases out there where there are cities in, more politically conservative parts of the country that are preparing for climate change without talking too much about climate change, which I think actually speaks to some of our findings here, is that people are not opposed necessarily to dealing with some of the impacts, but the climate change has become such a polarized issue that it actually is not too often constructive to talk about it in those terms, right? So there are other cases where that's not the case, right? I think California is on the other side of that equation, right? But I think it sort of speaks to the fact that climate change is not necessarily the only way to move forward with the kinds of policies that may need to be put in place. And I think that's certainly true with energy, but could certainly be true when dealing with sort of enhancing resilience and building sort of adaptation measures.
One last point.
Sure.
It seems to me, from observing political culture in the United States, we're in love with conflict. And so we like to say, yes, no, me, boom, boom, boom. And nobody comes around to the other and says, wait a second.
No. Okay. Yeah.
So I guess one of the flip sides of this focus on local environmental harm is that there's also more local opposition to actually putting in some of these projects, right? So, I mean, it's nice to say like, oh, wind power is great, but there's also concentrated local opposition to actually having a wind farm in your backyard. So is there any evidence, I mean, either from this survey or others, about, basically like, is this this focus on harms, is it basically cheap talk, or do people actually respond? Are they more willing to have projects in the
It's a very good question. So we do, I didn't talk about this at all, but in many of the surveys, we asked essentially a NIMBY kind of a question, right? So not in my backyard, as it relates to these different energy sources. And we've written separately about this. At least when you ask people, again, asking the public at large outside of a particular case, people express, as you would expect, pretty high opposition to a new coal-fired power plant, a new nuclear power plant, even some opposition to natural gas, but they love the idea, at least, of being near a solar, a sort of utility-sized solar farm or a wind facility. Now, that said, there are clearly cases all over the country where local residents are pushing back against wind farms in particular, complaints about noise. There are even complaints that they are creating health effects. So there is some pushback. But I don't think we have actually really good systematic evidence of whether or not how much that varies across energy sources. That has not been an area where there's been a lot of study. You can get some purchase from surveys, but that is different from a local actual case. And siting is hard for everything, for all kinds of land uses, energy or otherwise. So I think it's an area really ripe for further research. All right. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.